Okay, students, today in our Dewey-ing history debate, we're going to be talking about foreign policy, specifically the concept of American interest versus American ideals. We're going to start with this question-focused document made by Victor Gillum. He wouldn't take it any other way. So what do we see happening in this cartoon here? Based on the limited that you can see about this character, who do you think it is with those striped pants? Maybe a clue would be back here, this battleship. What flag is flying from that battleship? Okay, so if we're going to guess that this is America, and this is a native of some foreign place, do we have anything here that on him will identify who he is? We'll have to learn about that in the case study. But how is Uncle Sam getting the native to do what Uncle Sam wants him to do? Liberty and civilization is what's on the bayonet of that rifle. Are you supposed to push for things like liberty at the end of a bayonet? Is that how you establish freedom in a place? By pointing a gun at them? So maybe what we're looking at here is an example of America enforcing what it wants by the use of force. Is force always the best way to achieve your ends, to do what you want to do, especially if what you want to do is supposedly share liberty and civilization? It says he wouldn't take it any other way. What is Victor Gillum trying to show us was happening? Try and think about how this might be related to foreign policy. Does America always act with peace towards other countries when we're trying to advance our ideals? We're going to be talking about that concept of interest versus ideals just so we can better understand our case study. So in your own words, you're going to need to explain what interest means. We're going to look at the third definition. Used when discussing what is best or most helpful thing for someone. It's in your own interest to keep silent. Has anyone ever told you you shouldn't do that because it's not in your best interest? Tell me what interest means. Now you need to tell me what ideals mean. We're going to focus on this idea. The organization has remained true to its ideals. It means it has continued to work and support the goals that it considers most worthwhile and important. Your ideals are the things that you think are, these are the ideas that you think that are most important. To summarize that for me, in summary, if America is following its interest, it means America is doing what is best for Phyllis Blanken. If we're following our interest, who are we looking out for? On the other hand, if America is following its ideals, it means America is standing up for what it blanks. If we're following our ideals, if we're following what we think is important, what are we standing up for? For our contemporary debate, we're going to be talking about what's happening in Hong Kong. We need to find out where Hong Kong is first. Right here, connected to the mainland of China. So a quick history lesson you remember from world history is about the Opium War. So Great Britain defeated China in the Opium War, and under that they demanded that China give them Hong Kong as British territory. The British did that so they could have trade with China using that port. In 1997, Britain returned Hong Kong to China under the agreement that China would treat those people in Hong Kong with rights, the rights that they had grown used to having under Great Britain. If we are comparing rights under Great Britain, modern rights at least, to the rights in communist China, we might be able to assume that the people of Hong Kong would expect to have more rights than Chinese citizens. In early 2019, the Hong Kong government created an extradition policy that would make it easier for the Chinese government to arrest Hong Kong citizens and put them on trial in China. So even though the Hong Kong government is, in a way, separate from China, some members of the Hong Kong government are very pro-China. They want to support China. So if they make it easier for the Chinese government to arrest their own citizens and take them to trial in China, do you think those citizens are going to be happy about getting a trial in China? Is it possible that they may not get a fair trial? This results in massive protests. June of 2019, 500,000 people were protesting in the streets. Police began using fire hoses, tear gas, rubber bullets, and then live ammunition to fight the protests. The coronavirus, not the Chinese government, kind of led to the number of protests going down. But now for over a year, the Hong Kong citizens have been protesting what China's actions have been towards Hong Kong, and China continues to create new rules and laws through the Hong Kong government that make it harder for people to protest. Here's a picture of police moving in on protesters. So all of this is happening between China and Hong Kong. How does the United States play a role in this? We're going to learn about some legislation signed by President Trump. We need to know first what has led Congress, America's Congress, to create these acts.
President Trump offered a show of support this evening for pro-democracy demonstrators in Hong Kong. The president signed a pro-Hong Kong bill that the Chinese government had warned would be seen as meddling in its domestic affairs. Even as he signed the bill, though, Trump offered a conciliatory message to Chinese President Xi Jinping. Trump is trying to avoid upsetting trade talks with Beijing right now, which have reached a delicate stage. Hi, Elsa. So, just a few days ago, President Trump...
So this tells us pretty much everything that we need to know, but we'll go ahead and listen to the rest of the article. So we know the current situation. What are the demonstrators demonstrating for? Democracy? Isn't democracy something America is supposed to stand up for? The Chinese government doesn't want to see us meddling in their affairs. Trump doesn't want to avoid upsetting trade talks. That will help us with answering why people oppose our creation of the Hong Kong Acts. We'll get to that later.
President Trump was pretty non-committal on whether he would sign this legislation. What's changed?
You know, it's pretty clear this bill was going to become law with or without the president's signature. It passed the Senate unanimously. I think there was a single no vote in the House. So Congress was really overwhelming in its support for the democracy movement in Hong Kong. And Trump decided it was better to be on that train than under it. So he went ahead, he signed the bill, but he also reiterated his respect for Xi Jinping, just as he had done last week when he was asked about the Hong Kong bill in an interview with Fox News. Here's what he said on Friday.
We have to stand with Hong Kong, but I'm also standing with President Xi. He's a friend of mine. He's an incredible guy.
So since then, you've
Kinda
had
wants it
local...
both ways.
Yeah, he's really trying to walk this fine line. We've had local elections in the interim in Hong Kong, and the pro-democracy forces won a big victory. In his statement this evening, the president said he hopes the leaders of Hong Kong and mainland China can settle their differences amicably.
All right, so we just heard President Trump call Xi Jinping a friend. He's also a negotiating partner with some pretty high stakes trade talks on the line. So, how do you think signing this pro Hong Kong bill will affect the ongoing trade talks?
Trump acknowledged last week that Hong Kong could be a complicating factor in those trade negotiations, but he's really trying hard not to alienate President Xi to the point where he might just walk away from the table. For weeks now, the U.S. and China have been trying to broker a limited trade deal
Hmm.
in which China would buy some extra soybeans and other farm goods from the U.S. In exchange, they'd get some limited tariff relief from President Trump. Earlier this week, the two sides had a phone call, but actually nailing down an agreement has been really elusive.
Yeah.
And there is a deadline looming in less than 3 weeks. The Trump administration has threatened to impose tariffs on another $160 billion worth of Chinese imports, including a lot of popular consumer items, if there's no agreement struck by December 15th.
I am curious, though, a lot of this Hong Kong bill seems symbolic. What is the practical effect of this legislation?
The practical effect's not entirely clear. The bill says the State Department has to report each year on whether China is living up to the promises it made back in 1997 that it would preserve Hong Kong's autonomy.
Hmm.
If Beijing is seen as falling short, the administration could strip Hong Kong of its special trading status. So it is a cudgel the administration could
Ah,
use to go after China. But it also gives the president a lot of leeway, and Trump underscored that in his signing statement this evening, saying he would ignore any part of this bill that he sees as compromising his constitutional powers to conduct foreign policy the way he wants to.
okay.
Trump has argued that his friendship with Xi has actually been good for Hong Kong, that has helped to head off a tougher crackdown on the pro democracy forces. The bill does authorize sanctions against Chinese officials if they do carry out a crackdown in Hong Kong. And President Trump also signed a separate bill this evening that bars the U.S. from selling things to the Hong Kong police like tear gas and rubber bullets.
Okay, so I've already told you, and the article told us about what is going on in Hong Kong. We have pro democracy protesters, and the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government that's supporting the Chinese government are cracking down on those protests. What did the Hong Kong acts that were talked about in the article say the United States would do? One of them right here, a separate bill this evening bars the U.S. from selling things to Hong Kong police like tear gas and rubber bullets. Why do we not want to sell those things to the Hong Kong police? Who are they using those things on? Their own citizens, correct? Another part here is that the bill says State Department has to report each year on whether China is living up to its promises made back in 1997. If China isn't doing what it said it was going to do and respecting the rights of the Hong Kong people, then we could strip Hong Kong of its special trading status. Hong Kong trades a lot of the goods of China with us, and that prevents them from having to pay certain tariffs. If we do that, it's going to hurt China's ability to sell things to us. And China needs to sell things to us because that's where they make money. So people support all of these different Hong Kong rights acts because it's going to try and stop the Chinese government from mistreating Hong Kong. Why do some people support this? How did the article refer to these protesters? As pro-democracy. What, again, is America supposed to stand up for? Do we like the idea of the Chinese government cracking down on people who are protesting for democracy? And now we need to think about why some people would oppose this, because America is supposed to stand up for democracy at home and abroad. If we hurt trade with China, what might happen? Why don't you look around and see how many things around you are made in China? Why do some people not want to make China mad at us? What kind of relationship do we have that's important with China? Where do we get lots of our things? So the question that rests with you, should we support these pro-Hong Kong acts? Should we stand up for American ideals and fight for things like democracy? Or should we stand up for American interests and look out for our own bottom line, not try and hurt the trade that we rely on for so much of our stuff? It's time to start our case study. We're going to research Senate Bill 2295 to temporarily provide for the administration of the affairs of civil government in the Philippine Islands. We're going to start with our historic context to help us understand the bill. So we're going to go a little out of order. We're going to start down here. We're looking to find out what's happening in the Philippines. So as we've been studying foreign policy recently, we've talked about all of these different places they were fighting for independence from Spain. The Philippines were another one of those places. The Philippines were claimed as a colony of the Spanish in 1521. It took the Spanish until 1570 to actually conquer them. In 1896, a Filipino calls for the people to revolt against Spain. In 1897, Emilio Aguinaldo is elected president and creates a Philippine revolutionary constitution. Spain negotiated into the revolution and kicked Aguinaldo out of the Philippines to Hong Kong. So again, we have another Spanish colony fighting for their independence. And in 1898, when the U.S. declared war on Spain, because of what happened in Cuba, especially the sinking of the Maine, we go and fight the Spanish in the Philippines. We help Aguinaldo get back to the Philippines, and he sets himself up in charge. A group in America called the American Anti-Imperialist League was opposed to the United States playing this role, especially when it started to look like the Americas had interest in taking over the Philippines. When we signed that treaty of peace with the Spanish, remember that we bought the Philippines for $20 million. How do you think the Filipinos felt about this? They had been fighting for their independence from Spain after they helped defeat the Spanish. The Spanish then sell them to the United States, who had helped them in that war. Aguinaldo, who became the president, condemned this as the violent and aggressive seizure by the U.S. and threatened war in response. And on February 4th, the Philippine Insurrection began against the United States forces in the Philippines, following the killing of 3 Filipino soldiers by U.S. forces in Manila. So the Filipinos not only were upset about the United States taking over, we now have a revolution of Filipinos fighting the U.S. soldiers who are stationed in the Philippines. Despite this ongoing rebellion, we create a Philippine Commission to issue laws in the Philippines. So what we need to really understand is that the Filipinos had fought for independence against Spain. Instead of getting independence, they now are being controlled by the United States. Instead of just accepting that, the Filipinos are now fighting against us, but we're continuing to move ahead with taking control over the Philippines. So let's find out what Senate Bill 2295 would actually do. Section number 1. The President of the United States creates the Philippine Commission and gives the Commission the powers of government. For as long as armed resistance continues in the Philippines, the President will control commerce with and within said islands. So as long as the Filipinos continue to fight against us, who's really going to be in control of the island. Section 4. That all inhabitants of the Philippine Islands are citizens of the Philippine Islands and are entitled to the protection of the United States. Remember that if they're citizens of the Philippines, their rights are going to be different than citizens of the United States. Section 5. No law on the island shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process, or deny to any person equal protection of the laws. So we establish on the Philippines these rights that are important in America: life, liberty, property. However, habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless in cases of rebellion, insurrection, or danger to the public safety might require. So we had said we're going to give these people rights, but we're not going to give them those rights, or we're going to suspend those rights if there's a rebellion, which, as we know, there was. Section 6. When the insurrection ends and peace is established, we're going to order a census of the Philippines. We need to have a census because the next one, Section 2, we're going to hold an election to create a popular assembly of the people of the Philippine Islands. The Philippine Commission, which is basically the United States government and control, is going to start giving powers to the assembly. So it's only after the Philippines start fighting against us will we help them create their own government. The assembly shall send 2 commissioners to the United States. Property gained in the Philippines by the United States under the treaty with Spain are to be used for the benefit of the people of the islands. And importantly, Section 86, all laws passed by the government of the Philippine Islands shall be reported to Congress, which then has the power to annul the laws. So if we're going back to the start, in order for us to help the Filipinos create their own government, they're going to have to stop fighting against us. So until they stop fighting, we're not going to be giving those people their rights. After they have stopped the fighting, we're going to help them create a government for the Philippines. But in the end, who gets to be in charge of that government? Their government can create laws, but the United States Congress can undo those laws. So basically, the bill is going to say, we'll help you form a government if you stop fighting, but that government is going to be restricted in what it actually protects, what it gives you. Who's still, for the most part, going to be in charge of the Philippines? In section number 1, we're going to try and find out why foreign policy should advance American interests. We're going to look at this cartoon from Judge Magazine titled, "And After All, the Philippines are only the stepping stone to China." How does this cartoon show us an argument for why we should remain in control of the Philippines? Why should we plant our flag in the Philippines? Stepping stone. We're going to be able to use the Philippines to trade with which country? Why would we want to be able to trade with China? Think of all these things that Uncle Sam has. Where is he going to take those things? And what is he going to do with those things? If America is going to go and sell things such as American steel in China, having access to China is going to help America make what? How is ownership of the Philippines, control of the Philippines, going to advance our interests? What will we get out of being able to easily trade with China? Consider how that would matter in today's debate. If what was important to us about ownership of the Philippines was that it benefited us financially, it helped us make money off of China, how should we treat Hong Kong? Should we be doing what's in their best interest? or should we do what helps our relationship with China? Consider that. Section number 2, we need to find out why American foreign policy should advance American ideals. Remember that ideals are the things that you believe in. What are things that America believes in? Liberty, freedom, democracy. Let's look at this cartoon titled Liberty Halts American Butchery in the Philippines. Who are our characters in this cartoon? We see Uncle Sam, we see Lady Liberty, and we see a Filipino. What is this Filipino fighting for? Did he want to be ruled by the United States? Or was he still fighting for his liberty? What is Lady Liberty supposed to stand up for? Pretty simple, right? The idea of liberty. If Uncle Sam is fighting for control over the Filipino people, is he respecting their liberty? Just consider, what is America supposed to be standing up for? If we are fighting against the Filipinos, are we standing up for our ideals? Why does this matter for today's debate over foreign policy? What are the Hong Kong people fighting for? Ideals like democracy. If we're not standing by them and helping them in their fight for democracy, are we not standing up for our ideals? If you think we're supposed to be standing up for our ideals, then how are you going to feel about us not supporting those pro-democracy protesters? Okay, so we need to see the results of the debate. We signed the Treaty of Paris with the Philippines, took possession of the Philippines, but from 1899 to 1902, Filipino revolutionaries fought a war against the United States trying to win their independence. In that war, 4,000 American soldiers and nearly 20,000 Filipino fighters died in the fighting. Is it something we should be proud of as a country that our war to maintain control over the Philippines killed this many people who were fighting? Furthermore, an estimated 200,000 Filipino civilians died during the war, mainly of disease or hunger. If we had not been fighting the war against the Filipinos, might this not have happened? In 1902, during the war, we passed the bill that became known as the Philippine Organic Act or Cooper Act, creating a plan for a Filipino government under the supervision of our Congress. When the war is over, we helped them create the Philippine Assembly. But it's important to know that we maintained control in the Philippines, and there was a high price to that war. The United States pledges to give the Philippines their independence in 1916. However, in 1916, the Jones Act is passed, and we said we'll only give them independence when they have a stable government. So did we follow our promise to help them in getting freedom, getting independence? It's not going to be until World War II when Japan takes over the Philippines, chasing us out of the Philippines. The United States military retreated from the Philippine Islands when the Japanese invaded. But in 1944, the U.S. military comes back to the Philippines and helps free them from Japanese control. How is America going to look after just owning the Philippines, ruling the Philippines for 40 years, then fighting a war against the Japanese because we said we were defending democracy? Would it have looked good if we just took back over the Philippines? We decided that would be against our American ideals. We gave the islands full independence, and the islands are renamed the Republic of the Philippines. As a sign of thanks, the Republic of the Philippines gives U.S. land for military bases on the islands. In 1951, we signed a treaty where both countries agree to help each other in case there's an attack. We need to know that today there are more than 4 million U.S. citizens of Philippine ancestry in the United States, and more than 220 U.S. citizens living in the Philippines. So clearly, despite our war to subject the Filipinos to American rule, we have a much better relationship with the Philippines. You might actually know people living in your city who are from the Philippines, who are Filipino. We have provided lots of assistance to the Philippines after a typhoon hit the country in 2013. We have an economic relationship of over $25 billion. So while the war is obviously a pretty bad spot in our history, it is worthwhile to know that we have improved the relations, but really the importance of that relationship to us is also tied up in money. So why did we continue to maintain control over the Philippines even though they were fighting against us? Because it benefited us. It helped our trade. It helped American power. What were the consequences? How did America look for doing that? What's the similarity between these two policy debates? Well, today, who's China using force to control? In the past, who was America using force to control? So what's the similarity? We have a world power controlling a smaller country that is itself fighting for democracy. If you can, try and create policy advice for this. Based on our past experiences and the debates over fighting for American interests or American ideals, should we support the pro-Hong Kong acts? Should America stand up for what it believes in and support the pro-Hong Kong acts? Or should America do what is in its own best interest?